The Gulf Stream churned beneath a darkening October sky as Leonard Hutchins, a 51-year-old sailmaker from Charleston, South Carolina, steered his 32-foot sloop through increasingly hostile waters 40 nautical miles southeast of Cape Hatteras. The wind had shifted that Thursday morning in 1978, bringing with it the metallic taste of approaching weather that any experienced sailor recognized as trouble. Leonard had spent 3 decades in his cramped workshop on Market Street, stitching canvas for shrimp boats and racing yachts, building a reputation as one of the last traditional craftsmen in a trade increasingly dominated by synthetic materials and offshore manufacturing. His hands, scarred and calloused from years of pushing heavy needles through multiple layers of Egyptian cotton and dacron, gripped the wheel with familiar confidence. But the confidence was misplaced. The barometric pressure had dropped 6 millibars in 2 hours. Seagulls were fleeing inland in panicked formations, and the swells had taken on that oily, ominous quality that preceded serious storms. Leonard told himself he'd weathered worse, that his father, who'd sailed Liberty ships during World War II, running supplies to Murmansk through U-boat-infested waters, had taught him to respect the ocean, but never fear it. That philosophy was about to be tested in ways Leonard couldn't imagine. By noon, the wind had built to 30 knots, tearing whitecaps off the wave crests and sending spray across the fabric runner's deck in stinging sheets. Leonard reduced sail, dropping the Genoa and reefing the main down to storm configuration. But the motion was already violent, the boat corkscrewing through troughs that seemed to deepen with each passing hour. The radio crackled with weather updates about Tropical Storm Vera, which had unexpectedly intensified as it curved northward, its projected track placing Leonard directly in harm's way. He considered trying to run for the coast, but the storm was moving faster than his boat could sail, and attempting to make harbor in deteriorating conditions would be more dangerous than riding it out at sea. So Leonard secured everything below deck, lashed down the life raft and emergency beacon, checked his safety harness, and prepared to fight. The first serious blow came just after dark, a wave that broke over the bow with such force that Leonard felt the entire boat shudder, heard the groan of stressed fiberglass and the snap of something giving way forward. He couldn't see what had broken in the darkness, but he felt the boat's motion change, becoming sluggish and unresponsive. At midnight, with winds now screaming at hurricane force and waves towering 30 feet above the deck, a second massive wave swept the boat from stern to bow, and Leonard, despite his safety harness, was thrown against the wheel with such violence that he felt ribs crack. The wave took everything not permanently attached. The life raft tore free from its mounting and vanished into the maelstrom. The radio antenna snapped off at its base, and the emergency beacon, his only hope of electronic rescue, simply disappeared, ripped away by tons of moving water. If you're finding Leonard's story compelling, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and comment below, telling us where you're watching from. Your engagement helps us bring more incredible survival stories to viewers around the world. Dawn came slowly, revealing devastation that made Leonard's stomach clench with fear. The upper section of his mast had shattered during the night, the break occurring about 20 feet above the deck. The fallen spar had crashed across the stern, punching a ragged hole through the fiberglass about 8 inches below the waterline. Water sloshed in the cabin, already 6 inches deep and rising steadily despite the boat's natural buoyancy. Leonard's training took over, pushing aside panic and replacing it with methodical action. He descended into the flooded cabin, bracing himself against the violent motion, and began working the manual bilge pump with desperate rhythm. Each stroke lifted perhaps a quart of water, emptying it over the side, but more kept pouring in through the damaged stern. He needed to plug that hole, or the fabric runner would eventually sink, taking him down with her. Working by feel in the dim cabin, Leonard grabbed cushions, sailcloth, and marline cord. He stuffed 2 foam cushions into the hole, then wrapped them with layers of heavy dacron, the same material he used for working sails on commercial fishing boats, creating a makeshift patch. Using the marlin cord, he lashed the entire assembly to any fixed point he could reach. Cleats, stanchion bases, the companionway ladder. It wasn't elegant, but after 20 minutes of frantic work, the inflow had slowed to a manageable seep. Leonard returned to pumping, his shoulders burning, his cracked ribs sending spikes of agony through his chest with each stroke, but gradually the water level dropped. After 3 hours of continuous pumping, he'd reduced the flooding to ankle-deep water that he could manage with periodic sessions. The boat was saved from immediate sinking, but Leonard's situation had transformed from difficult to potentially fatal. His emergency supplies painted a grim picture of what lay ahead. The violence of the storm had contaminated his 2 10-gallon freshwater tanks. He could taste the salt when he tried the tap, rendering them useless. Of the 6 one-gallon jugs he'd stored as backup, only a single jug remained intact, wedged beneath the collapsed navigation table by pure chance. Everything else had either broken or been swept away. His food situation was better, but far from good. 8 cans of soup, 2 boxes of crackers in waterproof containers, a bag of dried apricots, and various condiments that wouldn't sustain life. Leonard calculated quickly. With strict rationing, he had perhaps 2 weeks of food. But water was the critical factor. 1 gallon would give him 3 days, maybe 4, if he barely allowed himself to sweat. After that, dehydration would begin its merciless work, shutting down his kidneys, thickening his blood, pushing him toward delirium and death. The Atlantic stretched in every direction, empty and indifferent. His last known position, recorded before the storm destroyed his electronics, put him roughly 120 miles east-southeast of Cape Hatteras. The Gulf Stream would push him generally northeast at perhaps 20 miles per day, but without engine power or proper sails, he had minimal control over his direction. Shipping lanes crossed these waters regularly, tankers bound for Norfolk and Baltimore, container ships heading to Savannah. But Hurricane Vera had scattered maritime traffic for hundreds of miles. The ocean around Leonard was utterly, devastatingly empty. On the second day, as Leonard worked to jury-rig some kind of mast from the broken spar, using techniques his father had demonstrated when Leonard was 12, the idea came to him with crystalline clarity. He was a sailmaker. He worked with waterproof fabric specifically designed to shed rain and sea spray. He had dozens of yards of various weights of sailcloth stored below deck, along with grommets, reinforcing patches, heavy-duty polyester thread, and sail-making needles that could punch through multiple layers of canvas. Sailors had been building rain catchment systems for centuries, crude tarps and buckets that captured precipitation during storms. But Leonard could do better. He could engineer proper water collection devices using his professional knowledge of fabric behavior, water channeling, and structural reinforcement. If rain came, and October in the Atlantic brought rain, he could capture it. He could buy himself time, perhaps enough time for a passing ship to spot him, for the Coast Guard to expand their search patterns, for luck to shift in his direction. Leonard descended into the still, damp cabin and began sorting through his materials with the focused intensity that had made him one of Charleston's most respected craftsmen, back when such skills still mattered, back when people valued the work of hands over the efficiency of machines. He selected a rectangular section of tightly woven polyester sailcloth, approximately 8 feet by 6 feet, that he'd brought along to repair his Genoa. The weave was tight enough to hold water, but flexible enough to form a basin when properly rigged. Working at his portable workbench, one of the few things still secured in place, Leonard reinforced all 4 edges with doubled fabric, stitching the layers together with the same parallel seam technique he used on working sails that needed to withstand years of abuse. Then he installed grommets at precise intervals around the perimeter, each one hand-set with his grommet press, each one positioned to optimize stress distribution. The work was slow, meticulous, demanding the same attention he'd given to racing sails for wealthy yacht owners who demanded perfection. But this time, the stakes weren't a lost regatta or a dissatisfied customer. This time, imperfect work meant death. Leonard created a central depression by running lines from the corner grommets to fixed points on deck, allowing the middle of the sailcloth to sag low. This would funnel rainwater toward a collection point where he positioned his one remaining clean water jug with its top cut off to form a wide-mouthed container. He tested the system with seawater, checking for leaks, adjusting the angle to maximize flow, tightening lines to prevent the whole assembly from collapsing in wind. The design was elegant in its simplicity. Water would strike the sailcloth, run toward the central depression, following gravity and the fabric's weave pattern, then drip steadily into the collection container. In theory. The third day brought no rain, just relentless sun that turned the deck into a griddle and the cabin into an oven. Leonard rationed his single gallon of fresh water with agonizing discipline, 4 ounces every 12 hours, just enough to wet his mouth, to keep his body functioning at minimum capacity. His lips cracked and bled. His tongue felt swollen, too large for his mouth. His urine turned dark amber, a warning sign that dehydration was already setting in. On the 4th day, with perhaps 12 ounces of water remaining, Leonard deployed his rain trap on the forward deck, securing it carefully to stanchions and rails. Then he sat in the cockpit and watched the cloudless sky, whispering prayers to a God he'd stopped believing in, sometime during his divorce 3 years ago, when Patricia had told him she was taking their daughter Amy to Seattle because she couldn't compete with his obsession with sailboats and the sea. The sky remained cruelly, perfectly blue throughout the 4th day and into the night. Leonard's water ran out completely on the morning of the 5th day. He'd saved the last 4 ounces for dawn, drinking them slowly, knowing they might be the last fresh water to touch his lips. His body was already suffering, headache pounding behind his eyes, muscles cramping from electrolyte imbalance, thoughts beginning to fragment and scatter. He'd read accounts of shipwreck survivors, knew the progression of symptoms that accompanied dehydration, confusion, weakness, eventual organ failure. He had perhaps 48 hours before his condition became critical, maybe less, in the October heat. Leonard lay in the cockpit, conserving energy, watching clouds build on the western horizon with desperate hope. By late afternoon, those clouds had darkened and spread, and by sunset, the first drops were falling. Not a storm, just steady, blessed rain that whispered against his canvas trap with sounds like salvation. Leonard stood on deck in his underwear, mouth open to the sky, feeling fresh water on his tongue for the first time in 36 hours. His rain trap worked perfectly. The sailcloth channeled water toward the central collection point exactly as designed, and within an hour he'd gathered nearly half a gallon. By morning, after 6 hours of steady rain, he had almost 2 gallons, enough to push death back from his door, at least temporarily. Leonard established a routine that would define his survival over the coming weeks. Each dawn, he checked his rain traps. He'd built a second and third, using every suitable piece of sailcloth he could spare, creating an interconnected system that transformed his boat into a floating water collection facility. He wrung out the fabric after each rain, capturing every drop, storing water in every clean container he could find. He rationed his food with the same discipline he applied to water. 1 small can of soup per day, a handful of crackers, dried apricots that he sucked slowly to make them last. The soup provided salt to replace what he lost through sweat, and the calories, though insufficient, kept his body functioning at survival level. He spent hours each day working on his jury-rigged mast, fashioning a small sail from his storm jib that could catch enough wind to give him steerage, Though without navigational instruments or working engine, he had only the sun's position to guide him westward toward land that might be 100 miles distant or 200. There was no way to know how far Hurricane Vera had pushed him off course, no way to calculate the Gulf Stream's cumulative effect on his position. Ships passed twice during the first 10 days, both too distant to see his signals. Leonard fired flares anyway, precious, irreplaceable flares that arced across the sky in brief red brilliance before fading into the vastness. He waved canvas, jumped up and down, screamed himself hoarse, but the ships maintained their courses and vanished over the horizon, their crews never knowing that a dying man had been so close to rescue. The isolation became its own form of torture. Leonard had always been comfortable with solitude. His workshop had been his sanctuary, a place where the rhythm of needle through canvas created meditation that required no words. But this solitude was different. This was the isolation of complete irrelevance, of being utterly removed from the human world. No one knew where he was. Patricia and Amy believed he was on a simple coastal cruise, expected him back in Charleston by late October. His few remaining customers would assume he'd closed shop permanently, another small business casualty in an economy that increasingly valued efficiency over craft. If the fabric runner sank, if Leonard disappeared, weeks might pass before anyone seriously looked for him, and by then the ocean would have erased every trace. On the 10th night, a commercial fishing boat passed within perhaps a quarter-mile, close enough that Leonard could see lights in the pilot-house windows, could imagine the crew inside drinking coffee, checking their gear, complaining about fuel costs and quotas and regulations. He lit 4 flares in rapid succession, turning the night into artificial day, screaming until his voice broke. The fishing boat maintained its course and disappeared. Leonard sat in the cockpit until dawn, understanding with absolute clarity that he might actually die out here, that his body might never be found, that Amy would grow up wondering what had happened to her father, creating stories to fill the void where truth should have been. But the rain came again on the 11th day, and Leonard's traps filled, and he continued surviving, one day at a time, one careful sip at a time, sustained by canvas and precipitation and stubborn refusal to surrender. The hunger grew more difficult to manage than thirst. Rain came regularly enough, every 3rd or 4th day, to keep Leonard hydrated at minimal levels. But food was finite, counting down towards 0 with mathematical certainty. By the 15th day, he'd exhausted all the soup and crackers. Only dried apricots remained, perhaps 24 of them, wrinkled and tough. Leonard allowed himself 2 per day, chewing each one slowly, extracting every possible calorie. His body, denied adequate fuel, began consuming itself. He could see bones in his hands that had never been visible before, the delicate architecture of metacarpals and finger joints emerging from flesh that seemed to be melting away. His ribs became countable beneath skin that hung loose. His belt, cinched to the last hole, still barely held his pants up. The mirror in the head showed a stranger, hollow-cheeked, wild-bearded, eyes too large in a skull-like face. Leonard avoided looking at mirrors after that. His thinking slowed, became dreamlike and non-linear. He experienced vivid hallucinations that felt more real than reality. Patricia and Amy sitting in the cockpit, not speaking, just present, their faces expressing emotions Leonard couldn't quite read. His father at the helm wearing his merchant marine uniform, nodding approval at the jury-rigged mast and the rain collection system. Once during the 3rd week, Leonard looked up to see his entire Charleston workshop reconstructed on the forward deck, his cutting table with its ruler embedded in the surface, his wall of thread spools arranged by color, his collection of specialized needles and palms and fids. He spent what felt like hours walking through this phantom workshop, touching tools, running fabric through his hands, before the vision dissolved in afternoon sunlight, and he found himself standing at the bow, swaying with weakness, uncertain whether minutes or hours had passed. The ocean itself became hallucinatory, its moods shifting with operatic drama. Days of flat calm alternated with squalls that tested his rain traps and his jury-rigged mast. Swells rolled past in endless procession, each one lifting the fabric runner with ponderous gentleness before setting her down in the following trough. At night, phosphorescence sparkled in the wake, and Leonard sometimes imagined he could see shapes in that ghostly light, mermaids or dolphins or the souls of drowned sailors, depending on his state of mind. During the day, the sun hammered down with brutal intensity, turning the deck too hot to touch with bare feet, baking the salt into his skin and clothes until he was crusted with white crystals. Leonard rigged shade using torn sails, creating a small refuge in the cockpit where he could escape the worst of the heat. He moved slowly, deliberately, conserving energy that his starving body could no longer easily replenish. Every action required planning, calculation. Is this necessary? Can it wait? What will it cost in terms of calories and water? Survival became mathematics, a constant equation balancing intake against expenditure, with death as the inevitable result when expenditure exceeded intake for too long. On the 20th day, Leonard's last apricot was gone. He sat in the cockpit holding the empty bag, turning it inside out to capture the few grains of sugar crystallized in the corners, and accepted that he'd entered the final phase. From this point forward, he had only water and willpower. His body would continue consuming itself, breaking down muscle tissue to keep his brain and organs functioning. But there were limits to that process. Medical literature suggested humans could survive 3 weeks without food, sometimes longer, depending on initial body composition and activity level. Leonard had started this ordeal reasonably fit, 174 pounds on a 5'10" frame. He estimated he'd lost at least 35 pounds, maybe 40. His body was eating itself to stay alive, but eventually there would be nothing left to eat. Sharks arrived on the 22nd day, 3 large bulls that circled the fabric runner with disturbing intelligence, their dorsal fins cutting the surface in lazy patterns. They bumped the hull experimentally, testing, and Leonard realized they'd learned to associate boats with food, either from fishermen's discards or from disasters that put bodies in the water. He stood at the rail with a boat hook, ready to defend himself, though he understood the futility. If he ended up in the water with those sharks, no boat hook would save him. The absurdity struck him with unexpected force, and he laughed, a harsh cracking sound that startled seabirds from their perches on his mast. He'd survived a hurricane, dehydration, starvation, and now he might be eaten by sharks in sight of salvation. The universe had a savage sense of humor. The sharks stayed for 2 days, circling, bumping, occasionally rolling to expose white bellies as they passed beneath the hull. Then they vanished as suddenly as they'd appeared, following whatever ancient imperatives guided apex predators through their ocean kingdoms. Leonard watched them go with something like regret. They'd been company, however threatening, breaking the absolute solitude that had become his normal state. On the 25th day, a storm arrived, not a hurricane, but a serious nor'easter that built throughout the afternoon into a howling tantrum of wind and rain. Leonard secured everything, took down his rain traps to prevent them from being destroyed, and retreated to the cabin. The storm raged through the night, waves breaking over the deck, wind shrieking through the rigging. Leonard wedged himself in his bunk, too weak to do more than hold on and hope his repairs would hold. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving Leonard soaked, exhausted, but alive. He deployed his rain traps again and collected nearly 4 gallons from the residual squalls, more water than he'd gathered in any previous event. His storage containers overflowed, and for the first time since the hurricane, Leonard had a surplus. He allowed himself to drink freely, feeling his body absorb the moisture, his mind clearing slightly from the fog of malnutrition. But water without calories was only a partial solution, buying time but not health, not strength, not rescue. The hallucinations intensified during the final days. Leonard had conversations with Amy where she was 25 years old instead of 13, telling him about college, her career, whether she'd forgiven him for choosing boats over family. He couldn't remember if these were fantasies or premonitions or memories from a future he'd never see. Time felt negotiable, elastic, stretching and compressing without pattern. He slept for what felt like minutes and woke to find the sun in a different quadrant. He worked on the boat in fugue states, making repairs and adjustments, discovering later, hours or days later, evidence of work he had no memory of performing. A new patch on the stern repair, adjustments to the rain trap rigging, reorganized supplies in the cabin. It was as if his body had taken over, performing necessary tasks while his conscious mind wandered elsewhere. Leonard accepted this dissociation with strange calm. His body knew what needed doing. His body was keeping him alive despite his mind's increasing unreliability. He trusted his hands. They'd been reliable for 50 years, through war and marriage and divorce and 30 years of professional sailmaking. They wouldn't fail him now. On the 27th day, Leonard tried fishing with improvised gear made from stainless steel rigging wire and chunks of leather cut from his deck shoes. His hands shook so badly he could barely tie knots, and the few fish that investigated his bait were too clever to be caught. He considered trying to grab seabirds when they landed on the boat, but they were too quick, too wary, and he was too slow, too weak. So he conserved his energy instead, moving only when absolutely necessary, spending long hours in the cabin visualizing rescue in elaborate detail. The sound of helicopter rotors, the descent of the rescue basket, the faces of the crew, the warmth of the hospital, Amy's hand in his. He rehearsed these scenarios obsessively, making them feel inevitable, using visualization as a weapon against despair. The Coast Guard helicopter found him on the morning of the 29th day, 73 nautical miles east-southeast of Oregon Inlet, North Carolina. Leonard had drifted in a complex pattern dictated by the Gulf Stream, prevailing winds, and his minimal sail control, moving generally northwest but covering perhaps 300 miles in his meandering course. The helicopter crew, based out of Elizabeth City and on routine patrol expanding the search grid for several overdue vessels from Hurricane Vera, spotted his jury-rigged sail against the morning sun. The distinctive triangle of white canvas, smaller than a proper sail but too large to be debris, caught the eye of Lieutenant Commander Janet Reeves, who directed her pilot to investigate what she thought might be a disabled yacht. What they found was a skeletal man surrounded by an elaborate network of canvas water traps, waving weakly from the cockpit of a boat that by all rights should have sunk weeks ago. The rescue basket descended through the rotor wash, and Leonard watched it approach with detached curiosity, as if this were happening to someone else, some other sailor in some other story. The rescue swimmer, a young Coast Guardsman named Dale Pritchard from Virginia Beach, later told reporters that Leonard was conscious, coherent, and insisted on explaining his water collection system before agreeing to be lifted off the fabric runner. "Document the traps," Leonard kept saying, his voice barely audible over the helicopter noise. "People need to see how they're constructed. The grommet placement is critical. The angle has to be at least 15 degrees. People need to know." Pritchard gently explained they needed to get him to a hospital immediately, that his body was in severe distress. Leonard weighed 131 pounds when they lifted him into the helicopter, down from 174 on October 7th when he'd cast off from Charleston with plans for a simple coastal cruise to Norfolk. They transported him to Albemarle Hospital in Elizabeth City, where Dr. Michael Chen and his emergency team began the delicate process of refeeding a severely malnourished patient. His electrolytes were dangerously imbalanced, Dr. Chen later explained to the press. His body had been cannibalizing muscle tissue for weeks, but remarkably, his hydration status was relatively good. Those rain collection systems he built saved his life. Without water, he wouldn't have survived a week. With water, he lasted a month. The recovery took 3 months of careful medical management. They couldn't simply feed Leonard normally. Rapid refeeding after prolonged starvation could trigger a cascade of metabolic crises called refeeding syndrome, potentially fatal. Instead, they increased his caloric intake gradually, monitoring his electrolytes constantly, rebuilding his strength through careful nutrition and physical therapy. Patricia and Amy flew to North Carolina from Seattle on the second day of his hospitalization. Leonard woke from a morphine-aided sleep to find his daughter sitting beside his bed, holding his hand carefully to avoid the tangle of IV lines, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "I prayed every night," Amy told him, her voice breaking. "Mom said you were probably fine, that you knew what you were doing, but I prayed anyway. I prayed to God and to Grandpa and to anyone who might be listening. I told them I didn't care if you loved boats more than me. I just needed you to not die." Leonard tried to respond, but his throat was too raw, his emotions too overwhelming. He squeezed her hand instead, tears running down into his wild beard. Patricia stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her face carefully neutral. When Leonard asked if they could try again, not the marriage, he understood that was finished, but maybe just being in each other's lives, being a family in whatever form was still possible, she nodded once, quickly, and he saw tears on her cheeks before she turned away. The fabric runner was recovered 6 days after Leonard's rescue by a commercial salvage vessel that towed her into the harbor at Manteo. Despite the hurricane damage, the storm exposure, and nearly a month of neglect, the boat was structurally sound. Leonard's emergency repairs, the sailcloth patch on the stern, the jury-rigged mast, the whole cobbled-together system of improvisation, had held. The Coast Guard documented his rain catchment setup before removing it, photographing every detail. The reinforced edges, the strategic grommet placement, the angled rigging that maximized collection efficiency, the ingenious use of professional sailmaking techniques in a survival context. These photographs would later appear in Coast Guard survival training manuals, in articles in sailing magazines, in maritime engineering journals where experts analyzed and praised the elegant simplicity of Leonard's design. "This represents practical seamanship at its finest," wrote Commander Harold Washington in the Coast Guard's official report. Mr. Hutchins applied specialized professional knowledge to a life-threatening situation and created a sustainable water collection system using only materials at hand. His survival is a testament to skill, preparation, and extraordinary determination. Leonard returned to Charleston in late January 1979, 40 pounds heavier than his rescue weight, but still gaunt, still bearing the psychological scars of 29 days alone at sea. His sail-making business had effectively ended during his absence. His few remaining customers, assuming he was dead, had moved on. The building that housed his workshop had been leased to someone else. But the publicity from his rescue brought unexpected opportunities. The Coast Guard invited him to consult on emergency equipment design, particularly water collection systems for life rafts. Sailing schools in Charleston, Annapolis, and Newport wanted him to teach survival workshops. A small publisher in Baltimore, Maritime Press, offered a modest advance for a book about his experience. Leonard co-wrote it with Bill Drayton, a journalist from the Charleston Post and Courier who'd covered the rescue. They titled it Canvas and Rain, A Sailmaker's Survival, and it sold steadily for years, finding an audience among serious sailors who understood the value of traditional skills in modern emergencies. Leonard never sailed alone again, though he did sail. He remained on the water, but carefully now, in coastal waters, always with crew, always with redundant safety equipment, multiple emergency beacons, and, always, the materials and knowledge to build rain collection systems if needed. He rebuilt his relationship with Amy gradually, through years of phone calls, visits, awkward dinners that eventually became comfortable. She came to understand that his love of sailing wasn't competition for his love of her, just a different chamber of the same heart. And he came to understand that she deserved a larger share of that heart than she'd been receiving. When Amy graduated from the University of Washington in 1987 with a degree in marine biology, Leonard attended the ceremony, his pride overwhelming. They sailed together that summer on Puget Sound aboard a chartered sloop, and he showed her how to construct a rain trap from a tarp and bungee cords, just in case. "You never know," he told her, rigging the system on a cloudless day. "The ocean doesn't care about your plans or your preparation, but if you understand how water moves, how fabric behaves, how to turn basic materials into life support, that knowledge can save you." Amy watched him work, seeing in his careful hands the same precision that had kept him alive when everything else failed. The story became a quiet legend in sailing communities, not as famous as other maritime rescues, but significant to those who understood the technical achievement involved. Leonard gave occasional talks at yacht clubs and sailing conventions, always emphasizing the same points: skills, transfer across contexts, preparation matters, and the human body's capacity to endure exceeds what we imagine in comfortable circumstances. He kept one of the original rain traps from the fabric runner in his garage in Charleston, the fabric still salt-stained, the grommets slightly corroded. Sometimes he'd spread it out and run his fingers along the seams he'd stitched in his workshop before that fateful voyage, marveling that something so simple, canvas, thread, grommets, and the understanding of how water moves across fabric, had purchased 29 days of life in the vast indifference of the Atlantic Ocean. Leonard Hutchins died in 2003 at age 76 in a hospital bed in Charleston, surrounded by Amy and her 2 children, not dramatically, just the gradual dimming that comes with age and accumulated years. But the rain traps he designed lived on in Coast Guard manuals and survival courses, in the emergency kits of prudent sailors who understood that the difference between dying and surviving sometimes comes down to old-fashioned craft knowledge applied in new contexts, to the stubborn arithmetic of preparation meeting opportunity, to canvas and rain, and the refusal to surrender.